You're listening to Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork, a podcast discussing the latest trends and technology in the food and supplement industries, featuring conversations with regulatory experts, quality and safety champions, and thought leaders across the industry. I'm your host, Lydia Adams. Let's jump right in. Hello, I'm Lydia Adams, VP of Marketing at Trustwell, and we're excited to have an awesome guest today on Food Tech Talk, Supply Chain Insights from Farm to Fork. We're delighted to welcome Francisco Martin-Rayo, a seasoned leader in commercial and operations strategy with a strong background in AI-driven solutions for the agricultural sector. As the CEO of Helios, Francisco leads a team that develops cutting-edge AI software to predict agricultural supply chain disruption and mitigate risks related to climate and economic factors. With extensive experience working with global Fortune 50 companies and governments, Francisco brings valuable insights into leveraging technology for smarter decision-making in food quality and compliance. Welcome to the show, Francisco.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
We're excited to have you. So I know I gave a brief intro on your background, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey and really what led you to focus on using AI for agricultural supply chain management and disruption predictions.
I came from, I'd say, a slightly weird background, right? I had been doing digital transformations at BCG. I'd run an AI business. And at the beginning of my career, I had imported avocados from Mexico. And my co-founder, Eden Janilar, she was a senior AI/ML engineer at Google. She'd won the Abby Award. We'd known each other for a long time. She'd also owned a restaurant. And so we had these very unique, some would say weird backgrounds in food and technology. And we had this hypothesis that we were seeing kind of the impacts of climate change accelerate dramatically. We far surpassed your 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius. And our hypothesis was one of the places that was going to be hit the hardest was going to be agriculture. And at the same time, we're in the middle of the most exciting technological transformation of our lifetimes. And we had these extraordinary revolution in artificial intelligence and machine learning. And you had more access to climate information because satellites had become so widely available and so cheap. And so we had this vision that we could build this AI platform that could actually help people predict where these agricultural disruptions were going to happen.
That's really cool, I have to say. So, you talked about this a little bit, but you've worked in a variety of sectors. How have these diverse experiences kind of helped you in your approach to get to where you are specifically with AI predictions?
It's a really good question. I think we've learned a couple of things based on my experience. One is I spent most of my career actually working with much larger organizations. And then really only the last 4 years, I transitioned to running startups. And one of the things that we learned as a painful lesson early on, I would say, at Helios is in October of last year, we launched the world's first virtual supply chain analyst. And we called her Circe. You could ask for all these questions. What are the biggest risks to my supply chain? What's the impact of El Nino? It was cutting edge technology. Nothing like this had ever been done before. And people hated it. And I don't want to go to your website and, or your platform and ask this, virtual analyst the same question. I just want you to send it to me in a way that's easily digestible for me and my team. I want you to fit into our own working model. And it was a really helpful lesson. What we ended up doing is we took Circe, we put her in the background, and now all of our customers get, highly custom reports, deep analysis, all created through our generative AI engine that's specific to them. But one of the things that I've learned throughout my career is technology can only move as fast as the people who are going to use it. And, especially in the procurement space, agricultural procurement is probably one of the hardest jobs in the world. You have super lean teams. There's not that many people with the right skill sets. And so you can't suddenly tell a team that's been doing this for 10 or 20 years that is stretched very thinly, hey, you need to find 30% more time to do something totally different, right? You really need to find a way to save them time and then engage with the way they're working today.
That's so applicable across a lot of different businesses for sure. So that's a great lesson. So I'd love to kind of talk more about climate change specifically. It's increasingly affecting, agriculture. How do you see these changes impacting the global food safety and quality standards in the coming years?
What's been really hard, I would say, about the last couple of years is we're right at the forefront with our partners around food safety and the impacts on kind of the food supply chain and climate change. And we're very lucky. We're part of the International Fresh Produce Association. They've got this great accelerator cohort of companies. And so we get to spend a lot of time with Their board members are your Walmarts, your Krogers, your McDonald's, et cetera. And for them, it's 5 alarm fire. The crisis is already here. What they're seeing is far more crop failures than they ever expected. And that most of your suppliers would have 2 different types of suppliers. You'd have your US season and then a non-US season somewhere else. And that was it. You didn't really have a lot of resilience in your supply chain. We saw in Guadalajara, Mexico, the temperatures went over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in March. That's our secondary crop. And that was shot. And so what it's requiring folks is to take a much broader look. How do you truly diversify your supply chain in a world where you don't have that same level of constancy that you did before? Presumably for the food safety environment, and you guys would know this far better than we do, there's going to be huge impacts on the energy grid as you continue to have hotter and hotter temperatures. And it will require more and more energy to keep things below a certain temperature, within refrigeration. And that'll just continue to drive costs.
It's a really important point. I mean, do you see a lot of food safety professionals today that are thinking through those impacts, or do you think it's something that you've had to sort of be loud about to explain where we're at with it?
I think it's well received in private, and I think you have to be louder about it in public. We were just at Climate Week in New York, and this was just really blew my mind. There's so much talk out there about we got to do better about our greenhouse gases, and we have to make these investments, and we got to flatten the curve and all that. And that's really valuable work. But only 6% of all the funds that we're allocating around climate change are around adaptation. 94% of this is in, a bunch of new ideas and a bunch of effort to try and flatten that curve or reduce our greenhouse gases. But the moment is already here, right? And we really need to see a shift away from that to how do you help food safety professionals adapt? How do you create a better ecosystem so that you don't have these types of outbreaks like we had in Virginia? Not only shut down a whole business line for Boar's Head, but also took out, one of the few factories that in a relatively economically depressed region in Virginia that now no longer has a way to support those jobs. That, to me, is the conversation that we're trying to shout from the rooftops, that we need to be really cognizant that we're in a new environment and what we've been doing historically isn't working, and we really need to start putting time and effort and thinking and resources behind adaptation.
Yeah, and I think that's really where, AI comes in. And we've been having a lot of conversations at conferences within the industry about, what does that mean for food safety? What does it mean for the food industry? I think this is an awesome use case. So maybe you can explain how AI is coming in to help to predict and mitigate these impacts that you're seeing with climate change and, how that works together.
We're very lucky that we got to build the company today. And, we couldn't have built something like this even 5 years ago. What we did that is really unique to us is we took the world and we divided it into 14 million hexagons. The hexagon actually fits much better with the world actually looks like instead of something like squares. And then for each of those hexagons, we've taken daily climate data, temperature, precipitation, et cetera, for the last 20 years. We also then created like individual machine learning models per crop. And then we also created these climate archetypes based on altitude, soil, precipitation, temperature, latitude, longitude, all that. And then we put all of this together to be able to create hyper-granular risk scores. The reason that's so important is, you don't care if it's too hot in Iowa. That's completely irrelevant. You care if it's too hot in Iowa for chickens that are laying eggs in September. There's a really interesting analysis where if temperatures get too hot for chickens, they'll reduce their egg laying by 50 to 40%. And so then you have that balance, right? We know eggs are incredibly expensive. They're incredibly expensive now because of what's happening with avian flu. Suddenly you have to balance, well, how much more money do I spend on air conditioning? Do I need to start adding air conditioning in places that historically didn't need it? And, who is passing along those energy costs to the end consumer for something that has been relatively cheap recently? And so for us, we spent, 2 years, building that hyper granular analysis to be able to give folks that level of granular analysis so that they know it's not, this black box that Helios just said, well, it's going to be high risk and you should watch out. But here's what's really driving that.
And then allowing them to sort of have those levers to pull and then understanding how those, let's say like in your example, the costs change where they're investing in the business and how they're making decisions going forward. I mean, I think that's really huge. So, you talked about globally. So let's dive into the European Union's deforestation regulation. It's a significant move towards sustainability and supply chains. How do you think that climate-related policies like this are going to really start to reshape the agricultural supply chain landscape?
We have a lot of customers who buy a lot of cocoa. And I think one of the most trenchant points about the legislation was if you're a small cold farmer, Cote d'Ivoire or in Ghana, or even if you're a medium-sized farmer, you don't really have the excess capacity to fill out the right regulatory forms. If you're Barry Callebaut, right, one of the large buyers of cocoa, or if you're Mars or Hershey's, Cadbury's, right, you're selling chocolate in the EU, you also don't have the time to make sure that the small holder farmer or even the medium-sized collectives have the right registration. And so what it's creating in a really perverse way, right? Because the impetus behind the legislation is to reduce deforestation in Africa. That's a good thing. The problem is what it's creating is most of your EU partners and buyers are now only going to work with a select few incredibly large companies that can provide the right registration and the right legalese around source of origin, country of origin, et cetera. And that's really negative for anybody who's not an incredibly large company in Africa, because what that creates is a two-tiered system where you as a small farmer will either have to sell at a lower price to the larger conglomerate or try and sell to countries that are not in the EU. Where AI, I think, can help is, we've started to do some interesting analysis around computer vision. You just take a satellite image, but it's really hard actually to see, all right, if we're taking a 1 squared kilometer view, how many of these cocoa plants are there? Where in the growing season are they? How much yield is there going to be? What you can do, though, is take a picture of it and say, all right, typically land this big has historically yielded X, and we can see how many cocoa trees they planted. And then if the person who is selling cocoa from that particular farm is trying to sell you a lot more than they would typically yield, that just becomes a red flag. For the EU, they're not super technologically forward, I would say, in their regulation. Even though that's a solution that can be created and exists today, right? It wouldn't count against the regulator. It's a tough time for both farmers and then buyers in Europe.
It sounds like you're kind of talking about supply chain disruptions here and changing the entire flow for companies that you serve. Is the AI then allowing them to mitigate the risk of these disruptions?
1,000%. I think what's exciting about the platform that we built, and we launched our commodity track executive dashboard yesterday, which now allows, covers 53 commodities across 85 countries. It's phenomenal. What it allows folks to do is we tell them usually months before the disruption happens. We did it for mangoes in Peru in August. Prices rose January. Potatoes in the UK, Belgium, and France last year, months before the prices rose. We got a lot of press for predicting the price of cocoa was going to increase. So that's been really cool. And what it does is it gives them two different options, right? You can work with your suppliers to see if you can mitigate that disruption, but you also have time to find alternative suppliers so that your end consumers don't end up paying the price.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me wonder, I think there's a lot of conversation sometimes about trusting AI. Is this real? Is this really going to happen? And obviously you've shown through that, it is, but how do you guys sort of talk about that and explain that to folks to help them to understand how it can help and that it can be trusted in this case?
It's a great question. We get that all the time, especially in agriculture. What's interesting about agriculture, I think, is that there was a lot of enthusiasm for artificial intelligence early on, right? 10 years ago. And then what you had for a lot of farmers is that you had these startups come in, offer some sort of service, take all the data, sell the data to somebody else, have the company be sold, and kind of leave the farmers in the dust. There is now, I'd say, a fair amount of pushback against bringing some of these AI solutions to the farm, understandably, because it has not been a good relationship over the last 10 years. And I think it's a healthy degree of skepticism. In procurement, especially, and I'd love to hear your view on food safety, it's not a super high-tech industry right now. You have really lean teams with relatively low technology, very lean budgets. So for them, I think it's important to be able to understand at a granular level what's driving the risk. Why are you telling me it's high risk? Why are you telling me there's going to be disruption? And then proving it to them, both with their own supply chains, but also historical case. But I'd love to hear, Lydia, how folks are doing in the food safety space.
I think there's definitely been a marked shift on things like your data living on a spreadsheet, for example. And, we still see it a lot at Trustwell where people come and say, we have a system, it works for us, and it has for a long time. I think your example with the regulation in the EU, and then as we look at FISMA 204 in the US, these regulations are starting to kind of require people to move past these old ways of storing data because it really has to connect across the supply chain. And it also has so many more benefits to use technology, really, to be able to connect those dots and have all of your data in one place and have that security that you really don't have with, I would say, older methods. And so I think we're definitely seeing over the last several years that shift where people are understanding, like, not only do we need to modernize how we're doing things internally, but we need to have all stakeholders at the table. And this needs to be a technology conversation. Are you also seeing that sort of play out in your work as well?
Absolutely. And it's a really great point. This company shall remain unnamed, but when I was working at BCG, there was a particular company we were doing work with that had spent $2 billion all in, right, on a digital transformation with an ERP system. And when you went and spoke to different parts of the HR department, they were still keeping their Excel spreadsheets. Well, I don't really trust the ERP, but I trust my Excel spreadsheet. And so I think to your point, it's exactly that, right? It has to be this broader conversation about technology and how it can really help you.
Yeah. I think for you, this is the first conversation we've had on this show, regarding climate change. And I think it's so relevant because it has increased risks for contamination, specifically for the food safety folks out there. How can they use predictive analytics, such as what you're providing, to address these food safety threats? You mentioned recalls earlier in the conversation, and I think that's very top of mind for our audience. So how do those predictive analytics really help them?
There's two ways, right? We have now better access to climate and weather information than ever before. And so that's just table stakes. There's incredible open source data around weather. We've gotten better at the weather models in terms of predicting the timeout. But there isn't an excuse anymore for a company in the food safety space not to be tracking weather. The second part that's really helpful is with kind of where compute, machine learning, and artificial intelligence is today, you can do incredible time series analysis of where you expect weather to continue to go, and you can start to tie it to those particular risks. And one of the things I think would be really interesting to do in your space is probably look at the correlation between different temperature. Probably temperature is my hunch, right? Really high temperatures are more tightly linked to outbreaks, and figure out where exactly that correlation exists. And then you could start predicting out pretty soon where you're more likely to see those outbreaks. And then what that allows you to do is twofold. If you're a company, it allows you to invest much more in the places where they're getting hotter, energy costs are getting higher, et cetera. Or in your cold chain, if you're probably going to invest more in your cold chain I would even say you probably do it more in Texas and Arizona, Arkansas. But maybe you should invest more in your cold chain in Minnesota because you didn't expect it to be that much hotter in Minnesota. And now that it is, it requires you to actually make an additional investment, whereas you expected it to be much hotter in Texas. We don't know. But as a company, it allows you to really target where your investments have to go. As a government agency, we saw this again, right, with the Listeria outbreak. I think it allows you to be much more targeted about where you're auditing and where you're requiring people to spend more resources.
How does that affect the suppliers? Because when I think about it from the perspective of a food company, I'm thinking, okay, does that mean maybe that I want to start changing where I'm sourcing my suppliers from based on, like you said, the rising temperatures? Have you seen that start to happen?
Yeah, it's really one of the things we worry the most about is that you're naturally starting to see, and that will only accelerate, a transformation of people's supply chains. Because Florida is the perfect example. Florida is natural, right? If you are drinking Florida's natural orange juice, 80% of the juice you're drinking is from Brazil. Florida used to do 200 million boxes of citrus a year. They're down to 20 million. And a big part of that is because of climate change doesn't really support citrus growing. And, there's a whole host of problems around what you can do with the industry. I think the state government is doing a really terrible job actually of helping them. They're basically paying farmers not to sell their land to developers, even though what they should be doing is supporting a way for them to stop growing citrus, which doesn't work anymore, and growing things that do work, things like passion fruit, pomegranates. But you are seeing that reallocation of supply globally. This is one of the areas where you need the government to help with that transition. Because if you have great farming potential or great farming experience in a region, even if you can no longer grow that particular crop, if there is another crop you can grow, someone needs to help you fund that transition. And it can't really be the private sector. It's just not big enough. And, ultimately then those costs are just flowing through to your customers.
When you talk about something like that, I think it can be maybe frustrating to see how long these types of things take. I mean, even when we just think about the drive toward, sustainability and recognizing the impacts of climate change, it's been a very long road in society. And specifically for the food industry, how do you drive that adoption? How do you ensure that people have this top of mind? Because I think this is one of those things that people can sort of think, oh, that doesn't really affect me right now, until it's really upon us that, oh, this is now severely impacting my business.
I think you said it. I think it's exactly it. You can't really get people to care or spend the money until they start to feel the pain. When we started the business 2 years ago, I remember we were doing work with a very large seller of French fries. And we were covering all the global facilities they were importing French fries from, 59 facilities globally, et cetera. And we predicted a big disruption, 8% yield, lower yield, et cetera, kind of a big deal. And we went to the head of procurement and said, hey, we predicted this for you. Are you guys okay? And I remember he said, listen, the world has to end before I don't get my potatoes. I'm top of the food chain. And yet in the 2 years since that conversation happened, we're starting to do work with some of the largest retailers in the world. And when we've predicted a lot more since then, we talk to them about these disruptions and they say, we got hit with that. And I think the difference is it used to be that if you were, one of the top food CPGs, right, your Mars, your Walmarts, et cetera, you were somewhat immune from that pain. You have Coca-Cola. That's no longer the case, not because you're less important, but because the volatility has accelerated so much that everybody needs to take a hard look at it. Because, as our advisor, Bill Hova, says, he was Coca-Cola's chief procurement officer, says it's never okay not to have supply. Regardless of what, you have to have supply because otherwise you can't have your product on the shelf.
Definitely. And I wonder too, if the companies that you're really well aligned with that are using your services and, your platform are they really more focused on sustainability as a core value? Do you see that as part of what's needed to drive these types of changes and to work with somebody like your company?
Yes and no. I think the pain that people are feeling from a climate change perspective and the need to refashion your supply chain and be much more aware, I think, of where the disruptions are coming from and much more predictive is distinct from the sustainability push. One of the difficulties of the conversation in this space is that everybody wants to do more regenerative. It's better for the environment. It makes sense. It's better for the land. But one, someone has to fund that transition. It often will take you 3 years if you go from conventional to organic. So your field has to be fallow for 3 years. 2, at the beginning, there are fewer yields and it is more expensive. And so there is this really difficult conversation that isn't really being had, where Unilever has done great work. They do regenerative tomatoes, for example, in Spain now. And a couple of years ago, Spain had a really bad disruption in tomatoes. Unilever did not. And so they could supply. But can you really do that at scale, or can you only do it at pockets? And if you are doing it at scale, what is the time frame for that evolution, if you will? But there isn't an easy answer necessarily. We have a customer that runs or owns about 40,000 hectares of coffee out in Brazil. And the last 5 years, they planted, a couple thousand hectares of new coffee trees and they've had unexpected frosts. And if you have a frost that kills a coffee tree, it takes about 5 years to make your money back from coffee trees. They've gone back to their big banks, agricultural banks, and said, hey, we really want you to fund the transition for us to do this in a different way. Maybe not grow coffee, maybe grow coffee in a more regenerative way with, different crops, et cetera. And the bank said no, said, we will loan you the money to plant coffee, just regular coffee trees. We're not going to loan you the money to do anything else. And, our customer says, well, we're planning that coffee's dying, right? Because we have changing climate, we have unexpected frost, we have shorter winters. And the bank, they said, well, that's what we're going to fund you for. You haven't seen the ecosystem really start to support that transition.
We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but the economic impacts to food companies can be huge. What measures can companies really take to safeguard against, that supply and pricing volatility?
That's why we exist. Thank you for the question. Number 1, go to helios.sc for supply chain and sign up. Number 2, I do think people need to engage much more aggressively with technology. I think agricultural procurement has always been a very old school and relationship-based business. That is not a criticism at all. It means you have to trust your supplier that you're making multi-year contracts with for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, that they're going to grow something and sell it to you and you're going to get it. There's an enormous amount of trust in everything I just said, because think about it this way. If I'm going to go buy 10 million mangoes from you in Peru, we agree on the price a year from now. You start growing the mangoes, you get really good mangoes. Brazil has terrible mangoes. Let's say we're in Peru. You could sell the mangoes on the open market for 2x. And so I have to trust you. You're not going to take advantage of me and say, well, I know we signed this contract a year ago. Or lie to me and say that we only had 50% of the yield that we expected. And then you sell the other 50% at double the price. And so there's a huge trust factor in it. And I think that has, in some cases, made it a little more reticent to technology in the midst. And I think what's happening now is you hear, when we first started, what we were giving customers the ability to was understand inside their supply chain where the disruptions were going to happen. So which of your suppliers were not going to be able to fulfill their orders. And the pushback we got was, we know and trust our suppliers. And if they're not going to be able to fulfill it, we're going to know. And that was true in some cases, not in others. But what they really wanted to have an understanding of is, well, how does the global commodity look like? The global supply chain look like? So not just, my spinach or broccoli or raspberries or corn, but globally, what does it look like? So I can understand where those disruptions are coming from and where else I can source from. That is one of the reasons I think where they need to start using technology really to start engaging much more aggressively with some of these solutions, because you can no longer rely just on your experience and your relationships, because no one has had experience in the last 2 years, the next 10 years of where we see climate going.
Those are two really important points. The trust is essential, and, being able to trust the security of the technology and the data being accurate is huge. And then, as you said, I think you're right. I mean, I think we've spent, again, I agree with you. It's not anything wrong with it, but we just spent so much focus on our experience and what's worked. And this is kind of a wrench to the traditional view of how things have been, and to be able to kind of look ahead and not necessarily look behind us and say, okay, what's ahead of us and what do we expect?
It's exactly that, right? And how do we look ahead if what's behind us is not predictive of where we're going? That's what we grapple with the most. Because maybe the last 10 or 50 years have been great to buy grapefruit from Spain, but maybe you won't be able to do that 5 years from now. Maybe the last 200 years have been great to buy champagne from France. But maybe in 10 years, you won't be able to do it anymore, and you'll have to start buying, British champagnes. I think that's the new world we're in, right? And I think one of the things that people really struggle with understandably, is if you have to divorce yourself from the last few decades of your experience, how do you plan for that somewhat unknown future? And I think that's broadly for food safety, for agri-food supply chain, for asset safety and asset risk and climate change generally.
And you bring up a good point globally. This isn't just, we can't think about it domestically. Like, even if you have in the past, like, climate change affects all of us across the whole world, right? And so we'll start to see a lot of those changes. So interesting. What trends are you really seeing emerging in the agricultural sector that folks need to be preparing for right now?
One of the things that we have found really interesting is there's a lot of really good companies out there that, if you look at this pyramid, right, to your point, farm to fork, at the farm level, there is so much good work being done by small, innovative companies trying to make that part better. Anything from robots that can pick strawberries better, to drip irrigation that is, much better at saving water, or different types of fertilizers, organic and regenerative, and much better for the environment. One of the ways they're really struggling, though, is that I have a new idea. I go to the farmer. I've got a really good idea. They say, that sounds really great. Let's try it next season. If you get a yes, right? So then you come back next season, that's a year. Say, oh, I remember you. Okay, well, let's do 5% of the field. And so then you do 5% of the field. And that's understandable, because 5% of the farmer's field, if it doesn't work out, that's your profit margin. And so if you're lucky, right, farmer says 5% of the field. And then if that goes well, maybe they do 10% of the field, 15% of the field next year. By year 4, you're bankrupt, because it just took you way too long to get to scale. And so one of the things I think that we're looking at is, how do you create those longer term relationships and funding motions for people to really revolutionize the farms? The other part, I think, to the fork piece, already there are really good solutions in terms of, really focused on produce. And one of the things that was really heartbreaking is we were talking to, it wasn't a customer, it was a very large grower of lettuces out in Salinas. And they showed us two different bags. One bag was perfectly clear and showed you this beautiful heart of romaine, but the other one was marginally less clear. And they said, this bag is made out of 100% recycled product and it's biodegradable and it's amazing. It costs a little bit more. This bag is just pure, old school, bad plastic. The really clear one. Most people will only buy the really clear one because the lettuce looks better. Because you cannot have recyclable plastic covering any of your fresh produce because it doesn't look as good. Marginal difference, but when you put both of them together, you're like, oh, well, I want the brighter romaine lettuce. So that was shocking to us. The second part that was really shocking, and that's on the consumer, right? Like we had to say, I'm going to pay a cent more and I'm going to get the slightly darker bag. The other part that was really surprising is just the amount of waste in the system. If you're growing a head of lettuce, you're leaving about 50% of it on the side. I mean, you cut 50% plus, and then you're only eating the core of the romaine. And that's because people want the really bright, hyper green core. And so people aren't really willing to pay or buy your darker leaf or your greens. And then the moment any of the produce turns slightly yellow, unsellable. And so I think a lot of the change has to be on us as consumers that, get that tomato that's a little darker, right? You've got that little brown spot that you don't like. Get the banana that's super green.
Interesting. So last question I have for you is for companies in the food industry that are listening to this thinking, okay, this sounds great. I think I need to start to introduce some sort of predictive analytics, some sort of AI. What advice would you have for them to modernize and to start this process?
Broadly, the suggestions I would make are really understand the problem first. So don't do tech first because that'll fail. Figure out what are your top 5 problems that you're dealing with and be open-minded. Are we spending too much time? Or are forecasting correct? Do we have a higher failure rate than expected? Do we have more waste than we expected? Are we paying more, higher prices for something? And then for those, then to your point, look at across all the different stakeholders and figure out, all right, who are all the different stakeholders involved? Which pieces of these can we put technology against? Because one of the ways, this is less at Helios, but in my previous role at BCG, one of the reasons you see digital transformations fail is because there isn't really adoption. And you're not using technology to change or accelerate your ways of working. You're just putting technology on top of existing processes, and then it's almost running side by side. And so you want to be really clear about what's the problem that we're solving. And then for that problem, what parts can technology fix? And then what part can we just fix in general, right?
That is excellent advice. Thank you so much, Francisco. This has been very enlightening and interesting. I learned a ton from your experience.
Thanks so much.
And thanks to our listeners as well. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and see you next time on Food Tech Talk. Thank you for joining us for another bite-sized nugget of Food Tech Talk, supply chain insights from farm to fork. To learn more about Trustwell and its technology platform that connects product formulation, nutrition analysis, and compliant labeling with traceability, recall readiness, and supply chain transparency, please visit www.trustwell.com. Thanks for listening.